Deep in the heart of the Soviet Union during the height of World War II, a group of researchers set out to conduct an experiment on human subjects that would test the limits of human endurance and the human mind. This experiment would later become known as the Russian sleep experiment, and its consequences would be nothing short of horrific. Well, kind of. We'll get into that. But first, thank you very much for watching and stopping by. Today's video is the story of the Russian sleep experiment. You may or may not have heard about it, but we're going to go over it. The Russian sleep experiment is actually a creepypasta story that has made its rounds on the internet dating back to about 2009 or 2010. For those of you who don't know what a creepypasta is, they're essentially just user-made internet horror stories, and some of these online horror stories or creepypastas do a fantastic job of setting the tone. These stories sometimes come from the user's imagination, but sometimes there are some truths to these stories. With that being said, get comfy, relax, maybe grab your favorite snack, and let's dive in. Disclaimer, some of the points that I'm about to go over in this story are graphic and vivid, so if you have a weak stomach, viewer discretion is advised. Our story is set sometime in the late 1940s, taking place in a covert Soviet military testing facility. Researchers of this facility gathered 5 prisoners, all of whom were considered to be enemies of the state, and brought them to a secret laboratory. The laboratory was soundproofed with only a small window to observe the subjects. The researchers provided the prisoners with an experimental stimulant gas, which was supposed to keep them awake for 30 days straight. Prisoners were told that if they could last the full 30 days, they would be set free. At first, the prisoners were optimistic. They made small talk and chatted with each other to stay awake, all things seemingly going fine, just swell, right? Wrong. As the days wore on, their behavior began to change. They became irritable and paranoid, lashing out at each other. They began to experience vivid hallucinations and complained about feeling of something crawling under their skin. For the first 5 days, these subjects hardly complained. They were determined to hold on, to complete the experiment, and to win their freedom. But then something happened. Something sinister. Something inexplicable. Their conversations and activities were monitored, and it was noted that they began to talk about increasing traumatic incidents in their past. The general tone of their conversations took on a pretty dark aspect. Paranoia set in, and then they stopped talking at all to each other. So, needless to say, we're not talking about having a cranky toddler running around that needs to be put down for a nap. It's a little different. They started to demonstrate severe paranoia, whispering in the microphones and the one-way mirrored portholes. They even thought that they could win the trust of the researchers by turning over their fellow inmates. And then on the 9th day, the first of them started screaming, running the length of the chamber and yelling at the top of their lungs for 3 hours straight, ultimately only stopping when he tore his vocal cords, rendering him a mute. The most surprising thing about the behavior was how all the other prisoners reacted to this. They continued whispering into the microphones until all of a sudden, a second prisoner began screaming. This second prisoner that was screaming began tearing books apart and smeared page after page with their own poo, and then pasted them all over the glass portholes of which the researchers were viewing them from. The screaming promptly stopped, and so did the whispers into the microphone. 3 more days had passed, and the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure that they were working. They had assumed that it was impossible that entirely no sound could be coming from the inside of the chamber with 5 people. However, the oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that the 5 must still be alive. On the morning of the 14th day, the researchers did something that they said they would not do. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke a response from these captives in fear that they might be dead or vegetables. "We are opening the chamber to test the microphones," they announced. "Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor, or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you immediate freedom." To their surprise, they heard a calm voice in a response saying, "We no longer want to be freed." There was a debate between the researchers and military staffing as to what the next move would be. Considering that they couldn't really probe further with the microphones, there was no response. It was decided to open the chamber up at midnight on the 15th day. They purged the room of the gas stimulant and circulated fresh air into the chamber, which immediately drew a response that they did not expect. There were 3 separate voices picked up on the microphone begging them to turn on the gas, desperate pleas to get this gas back on. As the chamber was opened by the military soldiers with the mission of entering and retrieving the prisoners, screams from the captives started to fill the room in tandem with the prisoners' loud screaming. Those screams of the soldiers could also be heard as they entered and witnessed the horror that was inside of this chamber. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although it was seen that there were no real signs of life left in the remaining prisoners. The food rations that had been provided to the test subjects subjects were pretty much untouched after the 5th day. Instead, pieces of the flesh from these deceased test subjects' thighs and chest were found clogging the drain in the center of the chamber. This blockage had caused a buildup of 4 inches of water on the floor. You see, the prisoners had left all sinks in the room running, so there was no way to tell how much of the water was water or blood, how much blood was actually lost from the prisoners. Of the 4 of the 5 subjects that were remaining, 4 of the 5 remaining subjects displayed significant injuries, with large portions of muscle and skin torn apart from their bodies. Examination of their fingertips revealed that the wounds were likely inflicted by the hands and fingers, not teeth, as they initially suspected based on the amount of flesh that was torn off. The damage inflicted on the test subjects was not limited to the external wounds. All 4 of them had had their abdominal organs removed below the rib cage, leaving their lungs exposed through the rib cage, and their hearts and their lungs and diaphragms remained in place, and the skin, most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been ripped off. The subject's blood vessels and organs were still intact, but they had been removed and scattered on the floor all around. The subject's digestive tracts appeared to be functioning properly, but further investigation revealed that they were consuming their own flesh. The horrifying nature of these events in the chamber were made more disturbing by the fact that it appeared to the test subjects that these inflicted wounds were all upon themselves. Most of the soldiers were Russian special operatives at the facility, but still, many refused to even go back to the chamber and remove the subjects. The test subjects continued to scream to be left in the chamber and alternatively begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on, for they did not want to fall asleep. The test subjects put up a very visceral and fierce fight. When the soldiers attempted to remove them from the chamber, one of the soldiers ended up dying from having his throat torn out. Another soldier was severely injured by having his family jewels ripped off. In the midst of this struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen rupture, and he began bleeding out very quickly. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of morphine and still continued to fight back like a feral beast. This led the prisoner to breaking ribs in the arms of one doctor. When his heart was seen to beat for a full 2 minutes after he bled out to the point where there was more air in his vascular system than blood, even after it had stopped. He continued to scream and flail for another few minutes, struggling to attack anyone within reach, and he kept saying more and more over and over, and he was very weak until he fell silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begged for the gas and demanded to be kept awake. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room that facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back within his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative that they had tried to administer to him to prepare for the surgery. He fought furiously against all the restraints and the anesthetic that was put out. They just could not manage this guy. He managed to tear away at most of a 4-inch leather strap that was put on his wrists, and he was held down by a 200-pound soldier, which still didn't seem like enough. It took a little more than anesthetic to put him under, and the instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subject that had died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had tripled the normal level of oxygen. His muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn. He had broken several bones in the struggle not to be subdued. The second survivor had been the first of the group who had started screaming. His vocal cords were destroyed, unable to beg or object to the surgery. He only reacted in violent disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought out. He shook his head yes when somebody suggested reluctantly that they try the surgery without anesthetic, and did not react for the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his, abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what little he had of skin remaining. One terrified nurse assisting the surgeon said that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling. Assuming this must be something of drastic importance, the surgeon ended up grabbing a pen and a pad and gave it to the patient so he could write out his message, and it said simply, "Keep cutting." The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetics. Although they had been injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation, the surgeon found it impossible to perform the operation because the patients laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subjects could only follow the attending researchers with their eyes. The paralytic cleared their system in an abnormally short period of time, and they soon were trying to escape the bonds that they had on them. The researchers tried asking them why they had injured themselves and why they were tearing tearing parts of their flesh away, and they just wanted to be given the gas again, over and over. They, quote, said, "I must remain awake." All three of the subjects' restraints were reinforced. They were placed back into the chamber, awaiting determination of what should be done with them next. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors, they considered euthanizing these remaining subjects. The commanding officer in the military, who was former KGB, instead saw potential and wanted to see what they would do if they were to put the gas back on. To which the researchers strongly objected, but they were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the three subjects were connected to EEG monitors and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, stopped struggling the moment they were slipped back into the chamber and the gas went back on. It was obvious at this point that all three were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject, he was straining in his spines against the wall. The remaining subject was holding his head off the pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired up to the EEG, most of the researchers were monitoring his brainwaves in surprise. They were normal most of the time, but sometimes flatlined inexplicably. It looked as if he was repeatedly suffering from brain death, just shutting off, before returning to normal. As they focused on the paper that was spooling out of the brainwave monitor, one of the nurses noticed that one of the patients, his eyes shut as soon as he hit the pillow, and his brainwaves immediately signified that he had went into a deep sleep, and then he flatlined for the last time and his heart stopped. The only remaining subject that could speak started to scream to be sealed in now. His brainwaves showed the same flat lines as the one who had just died from falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside and the three researchers that were administering this project. One of the named three immediately drew his gun and shot that commander point blank between the eyes, then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. He pointed his gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to the bed, as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. "I won't be locked in here with these things, not with you," he screamed at the man strapped to the table. "What are you?" he demanded. "I must know." That's when the subject smiled back. "Have you forgotten so easily?" the subject asked, and he went on to say, "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into the silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread." The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined and the subject weakly choked out, so nearly free. So there it is, the Russian sleep experiment. What do you think of the story? Could there be some truth to it, or is it just a horrific story that's inspired by past dark events of humans? Let me know down in the comments below. Likewise, I'll link the creepypasta story down below. Thank you so much for watching, and be sure to be kind to others, lock your doors, pay your taxes, take care.